The Rules Committee will come to order. We don't quite have a quorum present, but Mr. McGovern has encouraged us to proceed, and we'll note the presence of a quorum just as soon as we gain it. I think we'll have it momentarily. We're here for consideration of two measures, H.R. 4310, the National Defense Authorization Act, and the Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act, H.R. 4970. We're very happy to begin with and recognize the chairman and ranking member of the Armed Services Committee. And gentlemen, thank you very much for being here. I've been told by our staff that at this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, a quorum is now present. And we now have 20 more amendments submitted than we had last year. As I said in a conversation earlier today with Mr. McKeon, we had 220 amendments last year, and I'm told that it's 240 as of this point. And so we've got a challenging week ahead. I always like to argue that the 5 most important words in the preamble of the U.S. Constitution are provide for the common defense, and virtually everything the federal government does can be handled by either individuals or some other level of government except the work that you all do. And so I appreciate it, and it's very important. And so we look forward to your comments. Anything that you have prepared will without objection appear in the record in its entirety. And it looks like Mr. McKeon has a prepared statement and Mr. Smith doesn't. So we will take whatever you all have, and we'd welcome your summary.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's how we operate. I need my stuff ready.
You're prepared and he isn't? Is that what it means?
No.
Yeah, right. I know. I remember that last year.
Chairman Dreyer, Ranking Member McGovern, in the absence of Ms. Slaughter, thank you for allowing us to testify before you regarding H.R. 4310, the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2013. The bill passed our committee with overwhelming bipartisan support by a vote of 56-5. Such strong support would not be possible were it not for Ranking Member Smith's hard work and commitment to a bipartisan process. It's this kind of cooperation on the Armed Services Committee that has seen this bill passed for 50 consecutive years. This bill authorizes $554 billion for national defense and $88 billion for overseas contingency operations, consistent with Chairman Ryan's budget, which already passed the House of Representatives. This level of funding is nearly $4 billion more than the President's budget request, but it's still less than last year's request, and it's only an incremental step to address the $46 billion decrease to the military when considering where the President estimated national defense would be for fiscal year 2013 in last year's budget. Even with this modest increase to the President's request for the military, the 2013 defense bill reflects the fact that members of the Armed Services Committee and the broader Congress must make tough choices in order to provide for the nation's common defense. This bill examines every aspect of defense activities from the warfighter to the industrial base, recognizes that we live in an age of austerity, and seeks to enact positive policies and reforms necessary to provide our troops with the best training, leadership, and equipment in the world. But the bill goes farther. This bill actively rebuilds the military within the constrained resources available to us. We preserve some of our vital force structure, like protecting cruisers and slowing Army and Marine Corps end strength reductions to ensure the President's new defense strategy is not a paper tiger. We listen to the counsel of the service chiefs. For any move we made to restore force structure, we've also provided the personnel and operations funding for those forces so that we do not create a hollow force. These are bipartisan accomplishments of which we're proud. The National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2013 further achieves these goals by working to ensure that the troops deployed in Afghanistan and around the world, including the National Guard, who are our first line of defense at home, have everything they need to successfully complete their missions. Protect the sacred covenant between our government and our all-volunteer military, keeping the promises we made to provide for the health and well-being of our troops and their families. Invest in the capabilities and force structure needed to protect the United States from current and future threats. Ensure the men and women in uniform have the necessary tools to effectively fight the war on terrorism and defend the homeland while ensuring the civil liberties of the United States citizens are protected, and expand the defense industrial base and encourage innovation by fostering awards to small and medium businesses, thus incentivizing competition for every tax dollar associated with funding Defense Department requirements. I'd also like to underscore that the National Defense Authorization Act contains no earmarks. Moreover, we did not allow members to tuck pet projects into larger accounts that would force Department to make trade-offs to pay for these projects. Finally, to this end, I respectfully request that this committee issue an appropriately structured rule for this legislation which enables robust debate on national security matters and allows for the enforcement of the House ban on earmarks. I request that the Committee on Rules rule in order as many amendments as possible while ensuring that none of these would violate the Committee on Armed Services earmark guidance, which is consistent with the earmark policy adopted by the House majority. I also ask that the rule provide all necessary waivers for prompt consideration of the legislation, and the rule provide at least 1 hour of general debate. In addition, I ask that the rule provide authority for amendments to be considered en bloc. One thing that Mr. Smith just brought up to me, he has an amendment that's very important to him, and he was concerned. I think he heard something about it may not be made in order, and I want you to know that I support not his amendment, but that he have it made in order. With that, Mr. Chairman.
Let me just say, as we prepare to recognize Mr. Smith, that today's hearing is based solely on our goal of putting together a rule that will allow for general debate, and tomorrow we are going to be considering the amendment process for and we clearly will have, as has traditionally been the case under both Democrats and Republicans, a wide-ranging, freewheeling debate on your bill, and we certainly will do that, and I appreciate having you, Chairman McKeon, weigh in on the amendment that Mr. Smith has submitted to us. So with that, Mr. Smith.
Thank you. I want to thank Chairman Dreyer and Ranking Member Slaughter and members of the Rules Committee for, once again, hearing our bill and pouring through all those amendments that we submit. And I agree with the Chairman's assessment that providing for the common defense is our first and most important duty. I want to particularly thank Chairman McKeon and all of the staff in the Armed Services Committee for the job they've once again done in a very, very bipartisan manner, worked on a number of controversial issues. And while certainly we had our differences in committee, we had, I think, very fair debates, and we voted on those, and we'll do the same on the floor. But I think it's very important that we pass this bill. I think the Chairman and staff have done an amazing job of pulling it together, and I echo, most of his comments. I do think that, having an overall strategic vision for the next 10 years is particularly challenging right now. We all know the budget situation. We know where it's headed. There is no way we are going to have the amount of money we thought we had a year ago for the defense budget or for anything else. So we have got to really take a hard look at the next 10 years and say, what is our defense going to look like? How do we make the right budget and strategic and tactical decisions to make sure we can provide for the common defense? And I'm absolutely convinced that we can save money in the defense budget. You can look at the last 10 years and certainly be proud of what our men and women in uniform have done, but you can also look at that and see that there are areas where we didn't spend money as wisely as we should have. We can put together a better budget. I believe that the President and the Pentagon, in their strategic review process, did that. They said, okay, what are we realistically going to be able to spend? What are our needs? How do we make this work? That's going to be the challenge, I think, for this committee. With the rest of this process, as we get it through the House floor and then go into negotiations with the Senate, and then in the years ahead, as we deal with constrained resources at a time when, though we have constrained resources, the threats have not conveniently gone away. There are some who draw analogies to post-Cold War or other wars that we've had. I don't think that analogy quite works here. While it's true that we're completely out of Iraq, we're drawing down in Afghanistan, the threat from al-Qaeda remains. North Korea is no less belligerent or problematic, and Iran also presents enormous challenges. So we have threats. We have a tough budget. I thank the Chairman for his hard work making those two things come together and presenting a defense bill that meets our challenges and tries to live within our means. And with that, I look forward to your questions.
Thanks to you both. Thanks again for being here, and As a fellow Westerner, Mr. Smith, I will say that I like your look, but Mr. Hastings is happy to loan you his necktie when it comes to the vote on the House floor.
I do apologize. I just got off a plane.
We know how that works. I have no further questions. Mr. Sessions.
Chairman, thank you very much. I, as the chairman has done, welcome both of you, not just to the committee, but really to the introduction of hard work. I think that perhaps, Congressman, you said it best, there is not as much money as we thought there would be a year ago. We continue to have to find ways to do things, not just the military, but the government and anything the government does, with limited resources as opposed to resources which we have thought about for a long time. Can you give me some specific ideas about some things that are in this bill, Mr. Chairman, or either of you, Adam, feel free, that you feel very strongly about that the military should be listening about ways which we think they should go about the business of saving money while staying fit and prepared for that which lies ahead of us? I'd appreciate both of you, please, giving me examples of the things which you feel strongly about, which would be involved in the legislation also.
I met with Admiral Mullen last July, just shortly before he retired, and he told me that he had assigned the chiefs to come up with savings of $450, $60 billion. That has grown now to $487 billion. That's incorporated in the bill. That's over the next 10 years. So I think that the chiefs have put a lot of work in down there at the Pentagon with the Secretary, and they say that they can live with those cuts. Now, we're talking about $50 billion over the next 10 years. That's out of the base budget. We are asking for $88 billion for OCO this year. That has run as high as $150 billion. So that's been cut back with the troops coming out of Iran, and as they come out of Afghanistan, that should be cut even further over the next 10 years. But I think what really needs to be emphasized is we both agree that out of a budget the size that we're dealing with, you can find cuts, and they have done that. And they say they can live with that, but the sequestration that's scheduled to hit in January is another $500–600 billion on top of this. They say they cannot live with that will hollow out the force. The Secretary says it's not like shooting yourself in the foot, it's like shooting yourself in the head. And if the chiefs say if that happens, that if we do not fix that sequestration the way it's written, where there's no thought, all you do is go down every single line item and just take out 8 or 12%, depending on what they do with personnel, then that would be hollowing out the force. We would not be able to guarantee that we could adequately defend this nation and our interests around
Well, you would
the world.
never recommend that as an answer, would you, Chairman? Just going through line by line, just making a straight cut as opposed to a prioritization?
Would I?
Well, you would never be for a line cut.
No, but that's the way the law, as we're now living under, is written. That's how sequestration will take effect.
If I could take a stab at that, I think it's interesting. The defense bill that we passed out is about $3.5 billion above the president's budget. So in terms of this year, we're not in that dramatically different a place. My opinion, personally, I think we should have both stuck to the Budget Control Act, which would have been, the president was about 4.5 over the Budget Control Act. We're about 3.5 over that. I think another $8 billion in savings is something we should look at. I think that's one of the amendments that we will consider in taking a look at it, because it's not just this year, it's long term. We can't be starting more programs than we can fund. And to directly answer your question, where can we save the money? I think as we are now out of Iraq, as we're going to draw down in Afghanistan, as you look at the future threats, we can save money by reducing our ground forces. How much? The Pentagon laid out a plan for that over the course of the next 5 years. I think it's a reduction of around 120,000 between the Army and the Marine Corps. There's money to be saved there, because the threats that are most direct right now are from al-Qaeda and other non-state terrorist actors. We've got to make sure SOCOM and our intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance ability is beefed up. Ground forces are one way to do that. Another issue that nobody wants to talk about are personnel costs and specifically healthcare costs. Healthcare inflation is crushing businesses, individuals, governments. It's doing the same to the Pentagon. They insure a ton of people, and those costs are enormous. If there are ways to find savings in there, we're going to have to look at it. And then lastly, on procurement and acquisition, we've spent an enormous amount of money in the last 10 to 15 years on many weapon systems that didn't work out as planned. In many cases, it was because we had ideas and requirements that were beyond what was realistic. So we spent billions of dollars only to find out that we couldn't do what we knew we couldn't have done in the first place. We're going to have to be smarter about procurement. We're going to have to be smarter about what we buy and more willing to live with a set of requirements that's realistic instead of pie in the sky. So those are a few ideas, but those are going to be great challenges this year and in the years to come.
But I would like to also emphasize that in the budget, the Deficit Reduction Act, the savings that we came up with, half of them have come out of defense. When defense accounts for about 19% of the overall budget, half of the savings we've taken out of defense. We cannot solve all of the budgetary problems on the back of the troops. We have to, some way, go after the real problem, and that is the mandatory spending. Because if we eliminate all of the discretionary budget, we'd still be running a deficit of $500 billion a year. And, if we just totally eliminated the military and grew daisies over in the Pentagon and assumed that the world is going to become safe, I think whatever, looking forward, you see things one way. Looking back, you see things another way. And I agree with Ranking Member. I think we have spent money probably in ways that we shouldn't have. However, if we had had another attack like 9/11, which we haven't had, then we would have said maybe we should have spent more. These are some things I think we just need to really be aware of. And out of all of the spending that we do here in this building, the only one I think that is really in the Constitution is the common defense.
Well, I did not hear the word which, when in the little bit of time that I was engaged with the military, is duplication. I never heard you say that. I'm not saying that that would be a correct word to say today. I'm just really wanting to make sure that what you are looking for them to do, or that what they're looking to do, you agree and or help them manage that process. I mean, this is kind of like, we have lots of analogies around here, but we got to get to where they need to go with an agreement about where they're going to get and hold them to that. One other question I've got, I've not looked through the bill as adequately as I need to, and I promise to try my best. We are pulling out of several key areas up to and including, I assume, Afghanistan at some point that would cover this bill. What assets are we leaving behind, and what management profile and system are we looking at to make sure that the assets that we leave do not turn into others' hands? Did you address that in here, or is that inappropriate for me to bring up at this time?
There was, it's a huge undertaking. We have tremendous amount of assets that we had in Iraq and Afghanistan. There was a tremendous effort that they had to go through to catalog everything and decide some things out of Iraq were able to move to Afghanistan, some they sent home, some they left there with the people that are providing their own security in Afghanistan. They did in Iraq. They will do the same thing in Afghanistan. They haven't started that process, to my knowledge, at this point, because we're still looking 2 years out. We're still moving equipment in rather than moving it out. But that is a very thorough process that they will go through. Sometimes it's more expensive to bring stuff home than to leave it there. But the object never would be to leave it where it would fall in the hands of the enemy. When we leave, we should have when we leave Afghanistan, we should have over 300,000 the Afghan security forces that will be trained and have the ability, hopefully, to provide for their own security. They will need equipment. They will need wherewithal to do that. And I'm sure much of that equipment will be transferred to them with the idea that it's to protect them, not to be used against us at some future time.
I would say to both of you that I'm interested in following up with both of your, the committee on both sides to hear any further discussion as you develop on these two issues in the future, and so that you know when you see me, I'm interested in that. And I appreciate your time. I yield back.
Yeah, thank you very much. I want to thank you both for your hard work on the bill. I personally think that there's a lot more room for savings in the Pentagon budget than has been put on the table. But I just want to say one thing, and that is when Chairman Ryan was before the committee, I asked him how much did we borrow for the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq? How much did we put on our credit card? And he came up with a number of $1.3 trillion. And I will tell you, in my opinion, that weakens our national strength, that we have put all that on our credit card and never sought the approval of the American people to pay for it, or we never thought it was important to actually pay for it. $1.3 trillion on our credit card. That's not the way, I hope, as we go forward. We're going to be dealing with overseas conflicts and just putting on our credit card the way we've been doing it. And I think a number of us have amendments on Afghanistan. We have very different opinions, Mr. Chairman. I have a different opinion than you do on what our approach should be there. But because we have borrowed $1.3 trillion for these wars, I think some of us believe there needs to be more accountability. And I think for many of us, the only way to get at least have a shot at accountability is amendments on the floor. And so that I hope you'll be encouraging this committee to allow as many of those amendments on Afghanistan as possible to be considered, and that we actually allocate an appropriate amount of time so we can have an actual debate, and not just 5 minutes here and 5 minutes there. This is a serious enough issue, and I appreciate the President talking about winding down. I worry about what happens after. What goes on beyond 2013. What are the plans for the next 10 years? And whether or not we're going to have a debate on how many troops we're going to have in Afghanistan beyond that point, what the role of those troops are going to be. I think those are all legitimate things for the entire House to be able to debate. So all I'm saying here is I haven't seen all the amendments. I have an amendment on Afghanistan. I know others do. I hope that we're allowed to offer those amendments and have a real discussion.
So far as borrowing money for the war effort, we don't just borrow money for that. We're borrowing money for everything we spend right now. We're borrowing 40 cents for every dollar we spend, and not all of that is going to military. It's going to a lot of other issues that we spend money for. As far as amendments, we dealt with over 200. What was the final number? 230, 240 in committee. We finished up at about 2:30 in the morning. We had a long, thorough debate. I'm sure we'll have the same thing here on the floor. I think last year, Chairman said I think you approved 150 amendments. Nobody generally asks me what amendments should be on the floor. The only reason I brought up the one for the ranking member is
What amendment is that? I don't know.
I'm sorry. But this is the indefinite detention amendment it's on indefinite detention.
But my assumption is, unless the Rules Committee operations have changed since we were in the majority, that oftentimes staff of the Armed Services Committee are consulted about whether amendments are germane or not, or whether they're what their implication is going to be. So maybe
when you were in the majority, you didn't consult the committee?
We did. We did.
And now they don't?
No, when you said you don't get asked about what amendments to be made in order, all I'm simply saying is on Afghanistan we ought to have a debate. And I just one final thing I'll say, we do borrow money for a lot of different things, but when we go to war, we tell the brave men and women who serve in our armed forces that they're going to be put in harm's way. And to do that and to ask the rest of us to do nothing but put it on a credit card, I don't think is the right way we should approach these things. That's just my editorial comment. But all I'm asking for is a good debate on Afghanistan on the floor.
I think, too, that some of the things that you bring up are in the administration's hands. The administration, the President went and signed an agreement that we would apparently keep troops for 10 years beyond the 2014, and
I think
when
we'll
they have
have a say in that. That's all I'm saying.
when they have a meeting coming up shortly in Chicago where they'll further debate that, I think, I have no problems with
Thank you.
a good, thorough debate of the Armed Services Bill.
Thank you very much. Let me just say that we're always happy to have staff here, but we've had a couple or three members at the door who've looked in, and the front row is filled, and that's reserved for members only, and I've seen gone out into the hall now, and so sorry about that. I mean, but that's what we've got on there, and I don't know if there are members still out in the hallway. There are members who are waiting to come in and sit for the hearing. So we're always this is a small room, and we appreciate all of the participation of staff, but that's what the front row is. So you took one of those seats then, Mr. Johnson. We're happy to have you. Ms. Fox.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I appreciate very much the chairman beginning this hearing by pointing out that it is the role of the federal government to provide for the common defense. I speak of that often in my comments, particularly when people are concerned about the debt and the deficit in this country. And I point out, as the chairman did, that every other function of government except the common defense can be done at the local and state levels. And by individuals, yes, and by individuals. And the 10th Amendment reemphasizes that. I mean, the Constitution lays it out, and then the 10th Amendment reiterates it, emphasizes it, that, as the chairman rightfully mentions, either by the states or by individuals themselves. And I do think it is really important that we point that out. I have great concern about my colleague often pointing out the cost of our defending this country and somehow or another making that look wrong for this country, and that we've put that on a, quote, credit card. I need to point out that the wars that we've been fighting were authorized by large bipartisan votes in the House and in the Senate, and yet the stimulus bill was one vote. It's costing almost as much as the wars have cost us, $1.2 trillion, I believe, if you count interest. It was one vote, one-sided. No Republicans voted to spend that money. I'd also like to point out that while our colleagues on the other side of the aisle had control of the House and the Senate for 4 years, they didn't vote to defund the war. Also, under the president and the Democrats' control for 2 years, they increased the debt and the deficit more than had been set up for almost the entire history of this country. And again, the health care bill had no bipartisan support. It has put this country in tremendous debt, has increased the deficit. We are responsible for defending this nation. Has every dollar been spent wisely? Nobody can defend that. But if the Congress were not involved in so many other things that it has no business being involved in, we would have adequate oversight, I believe, of the military and of defense spending, and we could do a lot better job of looking after how that money's spent. And that really should be what we should be doing. So I want to thank the two of you. I want to thank you for the oversight that you do. Would I like to see more? Absolutely, I would like to see more. I'd like for you to pay attention to my colleague from Texas who has asked for us to look for ways to save money through the defense budget. But is this the proper role of the Congress? It is the proper role of the Congress to fund our military. We have a wonderful military. I thank them every time I see somebody in an airport, I pass somebody on the street. I thank them because whether they've actually risked their lives, they have the potential for risking their lives for all of us so that we can sit here and pontificate about how we're spending the money on those people. When I see the wounded warriors come back, and many of them come into this chamber to do a tour, my heart breaks to see that. And I realize we can never compensate them enough. We can't compensate enough for those who lose their lives. So I thank you again for what you do and for bringing the bill to us. We must provide for the defense of this nation, for the common defense. And I think we must look at the ways that we are asking them, hardworking American taxpayers, to pay for things that the federal government's got no business doing. And I appreciate your effort, and I appreciate the effort of all those involved with the Department of Defense, and particularly those who put their lives on the line every day to make it possible for the rest of us to do what we do. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
If I may, I'm sorry, I just had a big quick comment here. It's been said a couple of times up here that the only thing the federal government has any business spending money on is defense. And I just have to note for the record while I sit here, I don't agree with that. I don't believe that any realistic interpretation of the Constitution agrees with that. And I certainly wouldn't look at, Medicare, Social Security and say those are things that the federal government shouldn't be doing. Now, I'm fond of the common defense. I serve with Mr. McKeon and want to make sure we provide for that. But I don't agree with the rhetoric that says that's all the federal government ought to be doing. And I'll also point out that in the history of this country, we had never before, Iraq and Afghanistan, gone to war without raising taxes. That was the first time that we went to war and actually cut them substantially. So while I agree we need to provide for the common defense, I just don't want us to drift too far in the direction of saying that is all the federal government ought to be doing.
Before I recognize Mr. Hastings, let me just give you the statement that I said again, okay? I'll tell you the statement that I made. As I said, virtually everything that the federal government does can be done by the individual or at the state and local level. The one thing that cannot be done by any of those other levels is our national security. We can't call on the city of Los Angeles to deal with our national security, or the state of California, or individuals. We all know that. And so I think the point that's being made is not that there's nothing else that the federal government...
You will note that I did not quibble with your point.
Yeah,
However,
no,
the two folks to your left made a slightly different point that I did feel the need to quibble
Right.
with.
Well,
So I just had to throw that out there. But
Mr. Hastings.
yes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'll just remind you that many years ago in Oakland, they did have an international policy. So some municipalities take it upon themselves, and during the period of apartheid, a lot of state and municipal governments undertook to do certain things that are within the framework of the so-called understandings of those of us that are here. I wanted to ask Dr. Fox something. She talked about promoting and providing for common defense. And then Mr. McGovern mentioned the fact that we went to war in Iraq and didn't pay for it, as well as much of what has transpired in Afghanistan. When you refer, Dr. Fox, to the people's money, is it okay with you that we do deficit spending for defense? And it's inappropriate when you refer back to the period when my party was in control that we did deficit spending, and I agree with you. But is there a distinction in your mind that defense is okay to have deficit and other aspects of our needs in this country should not be or should not have been put on the tab?
Mr. Hastings, I'm not in favor of deficit spending for anything. I believe, again, if we weren't engaged in doing a lot of things that we have no business doing, we wouldn't have to be engaged in deficit spending even for defense. And I would say to Mr. Smith, there are other things that the federal government is responsible for doing, but I believe that we are engaged in way too many things the federal government has no business doing, and we should be very careful about that. I'm very proud of our national parks, for example. I'm thoroughly in love with our national parks and think they are a wonderful resource for the country. And there are a few other things, but primarily we should not be doing most of what we're doing.
I thank you, Dr. Fox. I also would reference Philadelphia in 1774 and the aspects leading up to 1776 in the Continental Congress's Articles of Confederation. In their preamble, that's somehow or another contorted from time to time here in this institution. They say, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense. And the clause that's always seemingly left out by my colleagues is promote the general welfare and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish the Constitution for the United States of America. I read that preamble and the commas that exist in it from common defense to promote the general welfare, and I come down on the side of it's as wise for us to promote the general welfare as it is for us to spend a whole lot of money on defense. Mr. McEwen, you said just a moment ago, and it must be awfully conflictory for you coming from having chaired education and been ranking member on that committee, to go to this committee and leave on the table the needs of America's children, while ostensibly we're supposed to be doing something for the Iraqi children and Afghanistan children by dropping bombs on their heads. I'm just very confused by that particular conflict. And when you reference it, I'm going to ask you and Mr. Smith, what does winning in Afghanistan mean, and how does that look to each of you? But more importantly, did we win in Iraq? And how is it that we won when we lost 5,000 people, we spent $1 trillion+, and we don't even have the opportunity or the right to ask the now constituted or getting constituted government to even pay us back for any of that from their oil, with the third or fourth largest oil field in the world? How can we sit here and say that we won the war in Iraq, and what does looking toward Afghanistan, what does that look like? I can't count for you all the countries that have been in that hellhole and have lost. So what is it that we are doing, and how do you envision victory, either of you?
I'm not going to wade into the Iraq issue, but I will talk about Afghanistan because that is, pertinent to what's in our bill right at the moment. The President's been very clear on this. What we want to accomplish in that region is to stop al-Qaeda from having a safe haven from which to attack us and to prevent their Taliban allies from being able to create that safe haven. Personally, I think the conflict defies a simple win-loss scenario. It's a matter of containing a clear threat to U.S. national security. Now, I will tell you, I'm much more in the camp of Mr. McGovern about how we go about containing that threat right now than the language even that's in the bill or even than where the President is at. I think our large military presence is reaching the point of diminishing returns in containing that threat. But the national security goal there is to contain a very real threat from al-Qaeda and their Taliban allies. I just think there's a better way to go about doing it now. We could walk through the last 10 years of history and debate each step along the way, but for right now, where we're at, that's where I think we should go to be able to successfully contain that threat. Yes.
is it not true that in many respects we have decimated much of al-Qaeda in Afghanistan?
It is true, yes, we have, and we've also, I think, done a fair job of containing them across the border in Pakistan, because that's the other part of the problem.
All right, so then
Yes.
if we look to Yemen, or if we look to Syria today, or if we look beyond al-Qaeda, there's a mindset here that the only terrorist group that's likely to affect the West and America particularly is confined to al-Qaeda. There are countless terrorist
Can I make
groups throughout the
quick
world.
comments about that? First of all, we are trying to focus on a number of different affiliates and different groups out there. I will say that al-Qaeda is the only one that has formally declared war against the United States. They did that back in 1996, and they have not backed off of it. So I will tell you, I will apologize to no one that on a national security basis, number one focus is that one group that has actually declared war against us. Yes, there are others worth being concerned about, but I think that puts them at the top of the list. And then we have to be worried about who their affiliates are. As you said, it has spread to Yemen and elsewhere. And that's why I think a containment strategy makes more sense, and that's why it's so difficult to be spending as much money as it takes to maintain such an enormous troop presence in Afghanistan when that is far from the only place where this threat that we've talked about here is coming from. So, I'll agree with that.
This bill, when all is said and done, offers to put 20,000 troops in Afghanistan to protect the troops that we will be withdrawing at some point in time. I'm having...
Yeah, this bill doesn't quite do that.
What does it do with reference
on
to
Afghanistan,
protecting the people that are there?
On Afghanistan, it has language in it, which I offered an amendment to try and strike, which basically supports the President's plan. It does say that you should keep 68,000 troops in Afghanistan until the end of 2014, unless you can show that it's not necessary. I think that's too strong. I think we can show it's not necessary, and we shouldn't put that number out there. And then it also says that post-2014, maintain a sufficient force to do counterterrorism and to train. I think going that far out into 2014 doesn't make sense. Now, obviously, this is not going to lock in policy. This is a sense of Congress language. We're not requiring, we can't require future Congresses and future presidents to keep a certain number of troops in Afghanistan in 2015. But I think even stating that our policy must, so fully contemplate a perpetual presence past 2014 is problematic. Although it is just a sense of Congress, not actual law, I have an amendment offered to try and strike that.
All right. I ask unanimous consent, Mr. Chairman, to insert into the record the statement of administration policy. And there are many objections that the administration raises, but I'll leave that to the record. Mr. McKeon, let me be more direct. Does this, I believe this measure as offered conforms to the Ryan budget. But does it exceed the President's proposal, and does it exceed the Budget Reform Act, the numbers? And
Yes.
so then, here again, we're talking $8.2 billion more than the Budget Reform Act, and $3.2 billion more than the President's budget. How did you all draw these numbers in the face of all of the things that we are confronted with in this nation? And yet, but here's where I'm coming from. All of us have traveled, those of us that are on this committee, not the newer members, but the chairman and I went to Iraq together. I never said this to him, but I was interested specifically in the period of time that we were there, in their water issues, because I needed to get a treatment plant in Belgrade, Florida, that I'd been trying to do for 13 years. And we passed by an area where we had spent $12 million on a water treatment facility that got blown up. I can't make this stuff make sense, and I don't believe we can make it up. So how in the world, in the face of the number of children that aren't eating correctly, let me go to something else. Do either of you feel that we are doing enough for veterans? I'm talking about the ones that have already been in the military in recent times. As well as all of us have these Veterans Administration hospitals in our areas. All of us know the waiting list is very long for our veterans. We also know that kids are coming home from Iraq and Afghanistan with more traumatic stress. We know that they're coming home having either committed suicide at greater numbers while in the military or after they've come home. They come home National Guard members or lose their homes to foreclosure in the environment that we're in. They come home to those foreclosures. They come home to more domestic violence than has occurred at any time in any of the wars since that time. In the meantime, all of us went about eating our ice cream, going to the movies, going on our cruises, doing everything else that we felt like we wanted to do, while other people whose families were in the military were sacrificing. And at the very least, could we not do something about making sure they transition away from Afghanistan and Iraq and any other war into a sensible job? There are veterans on the street in this country that ain't eating, ain't got no place to stay, and they served in Iraq. How crazy can we be by going down this path and spending all this money when in fact we could spend some of that money not only to help veterans, but to help some of these children? I leave my state today and I looked at the FCAT scores all the way across the board. White, black, Latino, everything have gone down. And that's because of a lack of resources, a lack of teachers, too many children in classrooms. And here we are going to fund some contractor. I just sat on the plane with yet another one. I overhear them all the time talking about how they're going to do their contract. Oh, it's okay if we don't do 20 million. The fellow said today, we can just do 15. Well, how in the hell are you running a business and it's all right if you're making a submission for a proposal and it's okay for you to come in $5 million less than what you want and to make a profit? You're doggone right they're making a profit. There are contractors all over this place, all over this nation that are bleeding this nation. And I don't understand how either of you can sit there and say we need to do more than the Budget Control Act and we need to do more than the President's budget. Tell me how and why that makes sense.
Do we want to have a full philosophical
That's
discussion
what
on
we'd like to have is an open rule
Here?
so we can do it on the floor of the House.
That's what you'll
You
determine, I
asked for a
guess.
structured rule.
You asked a simple question, though, why? I was at a meeting in the Pentagon. Mr. Smith was there. They had the Big Eight. At the end of that meeting, when the Secretary was laying out the budget, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs was sitting across from me. He looked at me and he said, in my 37 years in this business, I've never seen a time more dangerous than right now. I could turn around and ask you, how can we cut defense at a time that is the most serious threats that we have facing us? If you look at Iran, look at North Korea, look at China, look at the spring and Arab Spring, and yet we're cutting back defense. I just think we just have different, different goals, different things that we're responsible for. Yes, I was chairman of the Education Committee. When I was in Afghanistan last, we opened a school over there, not a school like we have, but a school for 500 children. They were pretty excited about it. 10 teachers made out of adobe and tents, and those kids will have an opportunity now. About a third of them were girls that couldn't go to school before, and we have helped provide that for them. Mm-hmm. Is that a good thing? Yes, I think it is.
I'll make a prediction for you. 10 years from now, the Taliban will be in control just like they were 15 years ago. But that's neither here nor there. The other thing that concerns me is Don't Ask, Don't Tell was repealed. And it was an unconscionable and unfortunate law, but it's now gone. So now we are going to relitigate it in this legislation by allowing, among other things, that we use this legislation to continue scapegoating gay and lesbian servicemen and women, and I think it's nothing more than a cruel smear job. It's petty, it's unreasonable, and this kind of bigotry has no place in legislation that is designed to support our troops. It's following a familiar pattern on the part of some in the majority. take something that has been and should be bipartisan and insert cultural gimmickry that unnecessarily alienates people. I believe that some Democrats are willing to work with some Republicans to ensure smooth passage and consistent support for military personnel in national security operations. But when the majority throws around partisan wedge issues like gay marriage, it only serves to poison the well and make this process adversarial. While I'm troubled by the price tag, I'm severely troubled by that kind of measure, and I can't vote for something like that that's going to tell a chaplain, who may be gay, I might add, in a state that might permit marriage, that he or she cannot perform a wedding ceremony for those that serve in our military. It's shameful for us to go down that path. I yield back the balance.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's my pleasure being here. I appreciate both of you being here. Mr. Smith, Chairman McKeon, I realize you don't have an easy job, especially on those nights that you're doing the markup of this particular bill. I miss that. Like I miss a hernia, but I miss that opportunity. I also recognize that y'all are doing an area that is one of the core constitutional responsibilities of Congress, and that is the defense of this country. You know, in 1780s, this country under the Articles of Confederation had a military of less than 800 men. We had no navy to protect our shipping because the United States had not lived up to the treaty with England that ended the Revolutionary War and had not given Tory property back. The British still held troops on American soil, on American forts. They had an armed enemy on our northern border, and they were supplying some of the Native Americans with weapons when those groups were not favorable to the United States. And there was basically nothing we could do about it. It is very clear that the defense of this country was on the mind of those who met in Philadelphia to come up with the Constitution, which is why almost half of all the elements that are given as responsibilities of government in Section 8 have a defense implication to those elements. And that is a responsibility we have. So yes, when you come up with this authorization bill, you are dealing with the core constitutional responsibility of this government. Some of the other things we do are not core constitutional responsibilities. Yours basically is. And that also means that the decisions you make here now do not necessarily impact what we will be able to do militarily or diplomatically this year. But 15 years down the line, the decisions we make today will determine what we can do both militarily and diplomatically. So this is not just a light decision to be thrown out here. It is a significant decision, and I realize the amount of time you both spend on this has its long-term implications. And that for the most part, what you have done well, and you're doing the right thing. I think there are perhaps some small issues in which I would like to see a few changes in there. But for the most part, I do appreciate it. I would like to ask one question, though. I remember that when I was on the committee, and it's actually had a long-term effect, there was a policy of non-disclosure that was implemented by the Department of Defense, which allowed the executive branch to basically withhold a deal of information that I thought was essential for the legislative branch to do its job as a co-equal partner. Does this bill handle anything, or does this bill address that issue of some of the non-disclosure requirements or regulations that had been in effect and try to change that? There was an amendment by Mr. Hunter that dealt with non-disclosure, because that has been something that has bothered us trying to get information. That amendment passed, and we'll see if we get it in the final bill, and hopefully we will. I think there's always some contention there, between us and the Pentagon. While we should be full partners, we're not always. So that's a troubling thing, but I think we're working to address it.
I appreciate your element to move forward on that issue. Obviously, it's something that Congress, to do its role, both oversight as well as authorization and appropriation, needs to know exactly what is happening, and we should be a partner, not necessarily adversaries. I don't know, Mr. Smith, if you want to address that issue as well.
There's always been tension between the Pentagon and between the committees, and it's bipartisan in terms of the amount of information they provide to us and the timeliness with which they provide it. And to some degree, I mean, the Pentagon is trying to, protect access to certain critical information. It's always a difficult balance to strike. They're also trying to make sure that they're, on the same page, that they don't have, multiple independent actors, offering opinions that differ from one another. And in a place the size of the Pentagon, it can be very difficult to get everybody onto the same page. But they do have to try as closely as possible to speak with one voice. So I respect the Pentagon's needs to try and balance that concern. And we on the committee, and same's true in the Senate, are constantly badgering them to provide us more information. And I imagine that fight will continue for quite some time. It's the nature of the competing interests that I just described.
Thank you. I appreciate the amendment that's been placed in there. I think that's a step in the right direction. And once again, I thank you for your efforts, and I would yield back.
Thank you. I'll be brief. I just want to draw your attention to the detainee language, which prohibits the transfer of detainees from Guantanamo Bay to the United States. I just wanted to ask the chairman what kind of the medium and long-term plan is. I mean, is the plan to continue indefinitely with the detainees in Guantanamo? I mean, some of them are in their 30s. They could be there for 40 years. Or is there some other end game or plan to either bring them to the United States or some other place if, in fact, their further detention is required?
There's not a plan to bring them to the United States. In fact, it's reiterated in the bill that they cannot be brought into the United States. I think, Ranking Member Smith, this is one of the areas we have some disagreement on, and he will have amendment to address that. No, that's a different issue.
Well, I know. I just real quickly before just to clarify that. Yes, no, it's clear the language currently says they should not be brought to the United States. But does that mean they would remain in Guantanamo? And if so, is that indefinite, or is there some other plan for these people?
I think at this point it's for the duration of the war, and we don't know when that will end. So I would say
which war?
The war on terrorism.
The war on terrorism. I would hope that our country would remain ever vigilant against terrorism. This is not a war on a nation state, of course. This is a global action against terrorism. It's difficult to define a war that is an ongoing role of the state to defend against terrorism.
Well, but we have found recidivism because we have returned many of the detainees to other countries, and we have found a pretty high degree of recidivism that they get right back into the fight. And so there's not a real push to make that happen.
Mr. Smith?
I think it's a huge problem, and that's why, I mean, certainly my opinion is we should close Guantanamo, and we have proven that we can adequately handle, the inmates here in the U.S. We tried and convicted over 400 terrorist suspects. We have locked up in our jails right here in the U.S. well over 300 people who are convicted of supporting terrorism or being terrorists. There's no question we can handle it. I know there's a philosophical difference there, but I'll tell you one of the things that's very problematic is the restrictions on transfer. Mr. McKeon referenced the recidivism rate, and that's one set of issues. That's if you're returning them to their home country in some instances. But we're not even allowed to transfer anybody out of Guantanamo to the U.S., for trial, for detainment, or anything. And I think that's a problem. And I think the plan right now, such that there is a plan, is that it's staying open in perpetuity. And I think that's a big problem, and we need to come up with a better plan.
And this, Mr. Smith, this current language would actually, in effect, handcuff the government and require that those people remain there by prohibiting their transportation.
Yes, I mean, we can't transfer them to the U.S., and there are severe restrictions on transferring them to any home country. So, yes, I mean, they are there in an extended limbo. And they're not all in the same category. Some of them are very, very bad actors. Some of them are just people that even by our own admission now we picked up when we probably didn't need to, but we got no place to send them. We don't want to be in the business of warehousing human beings, and I fear that's where we're at in Guantanamo. We need to come up with some sort of solution to that problem. And I am worried about it, and it's something we're going to have to keep working on.
Yeah, and it would seem to me that handcuffing any administration, Republican or Democrat, through legislative language is not constructive towards finding a solution unless one feels the solution itself is to keep them there for decades in that particular location.
Well, some of this problem has come from the administration itself, because we could have, we're now dealing with the 5 that planned the 9/11 attack. They are undergoing trial in the military tribunal system. That, the first time I went to Guantanamo, they had made a lot of progress in that, and then that was stopped, and they had to restart, and then it was stopped, and then they had to restart again. That could have been finished by now.
The prosecution of the 5.
Of the 5.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to second guess prosecutors. Presumably, there was some evidence that they were gathering to make the case, or give some other.
I was in the courtroom.
Sure.
We met with the lead prosecutor. We met with the defense, and the feeling was they could have had it done by a certain time, and that was a few years ago. And so
Why didn't they? Then why didn't they? Pardon? Well, I'm sorry. Why didn't they have it done then?
Because the administration stopped them from going forward, and then by the time they let them go again, a certain amount of time had passed, and they had to start all over.
Okay. I'll yield back to the gentleman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the 2 gentlemen for being here. You were asked earlier, Mr. McKeon, about whether or not this budget, whether or not this act conformed with the Budget Control Act. I want to ask you, sadly, we've only had one budget passed in either the House or the Senate, only been one budget all year long to receive a majority of the people's votes. Does this bill conform with that one budget that has passed here in Washington, D.C.?
Conforms with the Ryan budget.
Yes, sir. What's now the U.S. House budget?
It's higher than the Budget Control Act that was passed previously, but the total of the spending complies with the Budget Act.
Now, I will defer to you all. I read what Leon Panetta says. He tells me that using the numbers in the Budget Control Act would be devastating to the military families. And
if I could, he said the sequestration numbers. We're talking about 2 different things.
Which bill did the sequestration numbers come in?
The Budget Control Act has 2 parts to it. The Budget Control Act has the numbers that would have us $8 billion.
Are those separable, Mr. Smith? Can we just choose one and not the other? Or are we locked into using both of those?
Well, at the moment, we're locked into using both until January.
So what Leon Panetta said about those cuts being devastating, he was speaking to the cuts.
Not really trying to be overly argumentative.
Oh, no.
I just wanted to make sure we drew the line there and said Mr. Panetta did not say that the Budget Control Act number that we were supposed to hit for this year was devastating. He said if we go to the sequestration number in January, that would be devastating.
Well,
I want to clarify.
I don't want to be over-argumentative either. I want to find the answers. You may know then, what is the alternative proposal? I know the House-passed budget is a proposal to avoid sequestration.
So is the President's budget. The President submitted a budget that had...
And the President's budget then does not increase defense spending, does increase defense spending over the Budget Control Act numbers.
Let me attempt to answer the question. The President's budget had like $3 trillion in savings over the course of 10 years and would have avoided sequestration. He kept the defense budget at the Budget Control Act numbers pre-sequestration, whereas Mr. Ryan's budget, I forget the number, increased defense a little bit over, because there's 2 pieces. The first piece of the Budget Control Act cut $487 billion out of defense. That number is kept the same. President's budget avoids sequestration. Mr. Ryan's budget adds back from that 487.
A little bit that you
I
said,
forget what the exact number is. This year it's like $8 billion.
So when folks are talking about whether or not this is a Budget Control Act number or a House-passed budget number, you're saying the difference between the House-passed budget and the President's budget, really just a little bit in defense, a little bit higher in the House.
On defense?
Yeah.
It is higher. I forget it's $8 billion this year. You know, I forget what it adds up over the course of 10 years. I seem to remember it was somewhere in the $250 billion range, but I could be wrong. So not an insignificant amount.
I would imagine the House would pass a more conservative budget as far as the Defense Department is concerned. But thinking about my friend Mr. Hastings' point about dropping bombs on children's heads, I'm guessing it's substantially more expensive not to drop bombs on children's heads. I mean, indiscriminate killing, cheaper. targeted killing. As I go through this, I see radar system after radar system. I see smart bomb after smart bomb. I see aircraft after aircraft that seems designed to be extremely precise in terms of a war machine, which is by its very nature a sloppy proposition. Let me ask you, Mr. Smith, is there anybody out there thinking about people needing to have skin in the game and get what they pay for? Is anybody out there promoting a lower defense budget? And by lower defense budget, we mean having less precise tools. I mean, understanding that the trade-off there for saving the money is going to be more indiscriminate killing. Is anybody advocating for that?
Well, I really don't agree with the frame that you're setting here. The notion that the only realistic place to save money in the defense budget is to go with less precise weapons is not really what's out there.
Clearly, that's not at all what I'm saying.
Right,
what I'm saying is that precise is more expensive than
there are a large number of proposals to cut substantially more from the defense budget to the sequestration numbers that perfectly protect precision-guided weapons. You can, for instance, use fewer of them rather than buying cheaper ones. So there are a number of options to get us to a point where we spend less, and we can debate this. There's all kinds of studies out there that show a defense budget over the course of the next 10 years that spends $1 trillion less than what was projected.
By doing away with these weapon systems that we're describing, or not by other things?
By other things, by a lot of other
we
things
keep these weapon systems.
Yes, okay. We certainly, I think, would agree that no matter what we're going to cut, the one thing that we're going to keep is precision-guided weapons. As I said, we may wind up with fewer of them, but I don't know of anyone who sees an advantage in going back to weapons that are less precise. That doesn't save money or make us stronger.
Well, that brings us back to Mr. McGovern's point, which I agree with every time he says it. I was not here when we decided not to ask the American taxpayer to put skin in the game for pursuing national policy, security policy around the globe. I wish we had made a different decision then. I think you make different foreign policy decisions when you have skin in the game. We want people to have skin in the game for every other program the federal government's involved in. I don't think defense spending is any different. Again, relying on your expertise, which far exceeds mine, and thinking back to those days when taxes were going down as defense spending was and the war fighting effort was ramping up. Is there any thought there in the defense community, any belief among those who know more than I do, that we are advantaged as a nation by preventing rank-and-file taxpayers from having skin in our defense game? Or could we say, as Mr. Smith pointed out, it had been true in every other war-fighting effort, that having folks invest in the war machine is actually the best way to hold our foreign policy leadership and our military-industrial complex accountable?
I would just say that it's a factor. I doubt it is a decisive factor, but certainly if taxpayers feel it more directly, they would have that greater sense, yes. But that's, and I will say, it's true of the whole budget. I mean, the whole budget's out of whack, as has been pointed out. And, you know, as anyone who's studied the allure of debt can tell you, there is a short-term benefit to saying, hey, look, it's just going on a credit card. We're not paying for it. Makes you feel better in the short term, not so much in the long term. So, yes, across the board on the budget, the more we directly felt the cost of our expenditures, I think the wiser the taxpayers would be. And I think that's true of everything, not just defense.
Though, Mr. McKeon, you're not doing what you do for budget reasons. You're doing it out of a love of country, and I know a love for these military men and women and their families. Is there any reason to believe those military men and women and those families are advantaged by not getting the American taxpayer involved in the same effort that those families are involved in?
I'm not sure I'm understanding exactly what you're...
When we go to war...
Are you suggesting that we should have a tax increase or we should not have had the tax decrease?
I'm suggesting that wars should be paid for, that we make bad health care decisions if we don't have skin in the game. We make bad automotive buying decisions when we don't have skin in the game. And we make bad foreign policy decisions when we don't have skin in the games. Ms. Fox was talking earlier about how proud she was of our servicemen, and I share that belief. How she pours out her appreciation to them day in and day out, and I share that line of action too. One of the ways we can do that is to actually fund that effort as that effort is is going on to say we're not just with you in voice, we're with you in deed as well. I'm thinking that a lot of really smart people were here at that time working on those issues. I know you were not chairman of the committee at that time, but thinking through all the reasons Mr. Smith pointed out, there are lots of self-interested reasons why folks might not want to pay for something. The allure of debt is mighty, but is there any defense reason why we would not want to call on the American people to pay for national defense as it is happening?
Well, I think I'm older than everybody in here, and I remember World War II, and I remember that everybody was all in. I remember that the women didn't have nylons. There was gas rationing. There was food rationing. You couldn't get meat. Everybody couldn't. I remember my mom giving me a nickel or a dime that I would take to school each week, and I would buy a savings stamp, and I would take it home and put it in my book. And when I got $18 worth, I was able to turn that in and got a bond. And you've probably seen the posters where Uncle Sam is trying to sell savings bonds. It was a entirely different situation. I feel strongly that the American people are not committed to this. I think we have 1%, which is probably the military and their families, that is heavily committed, and they're giving their all, and the rest of us are at the mall. So I don't see where I'm in a position to fix that, but that's something I have real concern about.
The only thing I could imagine, I grew up reading more about Vietnam than I did reading about World War II, and folks chronicled the American people and the debate over paying for Vietnam, as well as being involved in Vietnam. And I just didn't know if this had become a national security issue to say we can't actually make good national security decisions if the taxpayer has to pay for it, because the taxpayer doesn't want to pay for it, and so we're going to be hamstrung in that way. But in your estimation, what happened in World War II would be a feasible model for war fighting and funding today?
It's hard to compare now against World War II. We were bombed at Pearl Harbor. That was a pretty galvanizing point that pulled everybody together. This one, we had a pretty devastating attack on 9/11, but I'm not sure that everybody really, they bought in for a short time, but I don't think everybody is able to tie what we've done in Iraq and Afghanistan to 9/11. And I do wish that the President would talk more about it. I wish he would tell more about good things that we've been able to accomplish. I was at a street fair Saturday, and there was a booth there that was doing things for the troops, and I went over to visit with them, and one of the ladies said, my grandson just came home from Afghanistan, and she says, I was kind of telling him, I think we should all come home and just forget it, that we're not accomplishing anything. He says, Granny, that's not true. We're accomplishing some really good things there. And he told some stories of how people were better off than before we came. But we don't hear enough of that. So when we hear the bad things, when we hear of a rogue sergeant that goes off, some of the bad things, then people just say, well, let's just get out of there, because they don't know why we're there and they don't know what we're accomplishing there.
I remember in the days after 9/11 when parents were pulling their interns out of Washington, D.C. You remember that, Mr. Smith?
Yes, sir.
The parents who said, I'm afraid to have my kids interning on Capitol Hill because I'm absolutely certain the next attack is going to come.
There were congressmen here that didn't want to come in this building.
That's exactly right, Mr. McKeon. And you think about what we've purchased in terms of security over those years. Who'd have thought now, 11 years later, we'd have been without a major loss of life on American soil? It's absolutely phenomenal what our men and women in law enforcement and the military taking those opportunities way overseas have been able to accomplish. I thank you, Mr. Smith, for what you do to make that possible. I thank you, Mr. McKeon. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I would first like to thank both of you for what you've done. I mean, it's a thankless job, and everybody has ways to.
Thank us all the time. I think we got.
Yeah, I don't know. I think that you've gotten some here that, while they may say it, I mean, obviously, we have some different thoughts. But what you do in regards to protecting this country, and I agree with Mr. Smith and with the Chairman in regards to what the Constitution lays out. It's not exclusive to the military, but it certainly is. Without the military protecting us, doesn't matter what else is in the Constitution, because it will have no value without what you do in regards to the military. My biggest concern, of course, is not bombs and bullets and equipment, but it is the people that we've talked about here that we send over, the 1%, that actually go to the fight for us. And I'm concerned about what happens when they come back, but I'm concerned about health care for them as we move forward. I want to make sure that we don't shortchange them in regards to balancing a budget, and particularly in regards to our authorization for defense. I want to make sure that we're the voice for those that have no voice in regards to being over there in the fight. I think we've tried to do that throughout the years, and I just want to make sure that we continue to do that in this defense bill, because I know firsthand what it's like to have 3 sons that are currently serving this country. I want to make sure that for those of us that we hear this all the time, skin in the game, that we make sure that we think about the wives and the children and loved ones that they leave behind, but make sure that we're there for them when they need us the most. And that's in regards to taking care of them and their health care as they come back and transition back. And I don't care about money that we send to other foreign countries. I'd rather use that money to take care of those folks back here in regards, particularly those that have put their lives on the lines for us. So I want to hear, I guess, from both of you to make sure that my concerns are met in regards to taking care of these men and women that have volunteered to serve this country.
That is and always has been the number one concern of the committee. Chairman McKeon, when he talks about what we do, and Chairman Skelton before him, said our number one obligation is to protect the troops and provide for them totally, completely, while they're serving and after. Whatever mission it is they're asked to do, it is our job to make sure they are given the full support necessary to do that job. And it will continue to be our top priority for as long as we're on the committee, and I suspect for all who will come after us.
How does TRICARE figure into this mix in regards to this particular piece of legislation?
Let me just read a little bit of the handout that we put out. The NDAA bill restates the firmly held sense of Congress that prior service to our nation is a prepayment of health care benefits in retirement. As such, it rejects the President's proposal to increase some TRICARE fees and establish new TRICARE fees. The President's budget proposed more than doubling pharmacy copays and an annual enrollment fee for the TRICARE for Life benefit for Medicare-eligible retirees, income-based enrollment fees for TRICARE Prime, and an enrollment fee for TRICARE Standard and Extra, and raising TRICARE Standard and Extra deductibles. In contrast, our bill includes a modest increase in TRICARE pharmacy copays in 2013 and a cap on pharmacy copays beginning in 2014 that would allow fees to rise by no more than the annual retiree COLA. And that's what we did with the TRICARE last year, that the retirees pay from the time they retire until they hit 65. We had a very modest increase. It was $5 a month for a single and $10 for a family. And then we capped that with the annual COLA. This was the same similar type thing with the pharmacy. We limited troop reductions, not as as rapid as they had wanted to bring them down. We have a bipartisan effort to provide significant new regulations and procedures for combating and prosecuting sexual assault within the military. And we had the Religious Freedom Conscience Clause for military chaplains and service members. So the way we want to make sure that we keep the promises to those who join the military. You know, this war is not like other wars either, where you have a front line,
Right.
and the front line troops were at risk and the rear were pretty safe. In this war, you could be attacked anywhere, anytime. Fort Hood. So I think that anybody in the uniform is at risk at any time. It's just the way it is. We had 2 officers killed a couple of months ago sitting at their desks in an office. And there is no safe place.
I agree. And along with Mr. Woodall and also Mr. McGovern, I wish in the future, obviously, is that when we, it's not your responsibility, first of all. But I would think that, particularly on 9/11, you saw the cars with everybody with American flags on their cars, and how the support for this country, but then the support for our troops, and we see this every day. I was there when my son came back from mid-deployment from Afghanistan, and when he was the last one off the plane, and everybody waiting for that plane got up and cheered for him. It's a great feeling. But I would hope next time that whoever the administration is that if we're attacked like that again, you mentioned Pearl Harbor, but I think 9/11 was Pearl Harbor for us, at least for us that were here. That we then look at it and use that then to help pay for this. Because it wouldn't cover all of our deficit spending, but at least it goes somewhere in regards to paying for what we all obviously feel very strongly about is protecting this country. I don't think anybody would dispute that. Now, we've gotten way off in regards to our spending. Everybody wants to blame it on the wars. That's not accurate. But when you talk about defending countries, if you look at South Korea, I went to South Korea to see my son when his first deployment to South Korea, and the guy that's driving the bus was there as a child when they were overrun by North Koreans, and how they were forced into slave labor. And then we came back. And his mother was killed by a bombing raid by U.S. troops. Killed her. But he is so thankful for America's intervention, because if you look at South Korea now, North Korea was the industrial might. South Korea was beholden to North Korea, had to buy their power from North Korea. And now if you look at the role reversed and what capitalism did for South Korea, and freedoms that were instilled because of our troops that went over there and died for their freedoms. That is a possibility when we're involved. When my good friend here, Mr. Woodall, and I went to Afghanistan, and you think back to Harry Wilson's War, remember that? The movie? Charlie Wilson, I'm sorry, Harry, but Charlie Wilson's War. I'm great with that. But we sat in the movie, my wife and I, my son, when that movie came out, my son was in Afghanistan fighting, and we said, had they only spent a few bucks maybe and educated the Afghan kids, because when we were there, they were hoping to go to 3rd grade, to get a 3rd grade education, at least enough so they can read, write, and count.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'll wait.
And I'll wind this up. I just want to say that there's more at stake in the future of this country, and what we don't want to do is make the same mistakes that we've made every time we've gotten out of a conflict, is hollow out our force. You all are responsible, in my estimation, to helping us not go there. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'm done.
Mr. Scott, Mr. Wester, gentlemen, thank you both very much for being here. That will conclude the hearing portion for consideration of this measure. Now we will thank you, and we've spent an hour and a half on this. We have votes pending. We only have 13 witnesses to go as we move now to the Violence Against Women Act. We're happy to welcome the subcommittee chair, Mr. Gowdy, and we have members of the Judiciary Committee, Mr. Conyers, Mr. Scott, Ms. Lofgren, and Ms. Jackson-Lee. And so, Mr. Gowdy, Mr. Gowdy is not here.
He's here. He's out right here. He's here.
Okay, then we'll begin with Mr. Gowdy, and then it looks like Mr. Gowdy, any prepared statement that you have will appear in the record in its entirety, and we welcome your summary. We were hoping to get the work done before the votes, but I'm a little skeptical about our prospect of doing that with 13 witnesses ahead of us. So we'll proceed with you, and then I don't see Mr. Conyers here. Are you representing Mr. Conyers in this? Okay. So, Mr. Gowdy, as I said, any prepared statement that you have will appear in the record in its entirety. We welcome your summary.
Mr. Chairman, in light of the time and my historic inability to do a good job summarizing things, I would rely on my statement and be delighted to answer any questions.
You're being very modest, but I certainly appreciate what you've just done. Let me say we'll go to Mr. Scott, who's the ranking member of the subcommittee. Mr. Scott?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to defer to the Senator from California who will be offering the comprehensive substitute, and I'll speak to my amendment.
Okay. Ms. Lofgren?
Mr. Chairman, before today, every VAWA bill we've considered in the last 20 years had three things in common. It's been bipartisan, it's been written in consultation with advocates and service providers on the front lines for domestic violence, and it has sought to further protect battered women and other victims of serious crime. This bill shares none of those attributes, and the amendment offered by Ms. Adams, or will be offered, we've seen it, does not change that. Unlike any VAWA bill before it, the bill was developed without any input or support from the minority or the leading domestic violence advocates. It rolls back protections for battered spouses, victims of serious crimes such as rape and sexual assault, and it does so by weakening or entirely repealing provisions that have been in law for decades and that were approved by near unanimous consideration of this body in prior years. Let's be clear, this bill weakens or repeals provisions that had near unanimous support of Democrats and Republicans in past years. Each of the provisions was either added or expanded in the Republican Congresses in 1996, 2000, and 2005. In the year 2000, the Chris Smith bill that first created the U-Visa and extended VAWA protections would have passed unanimously if not for the single no vote of Mark Sanford. The 2005 bill from Jim Sensenbrenner that further expanded these protections first passed the House overwhelmingly, 415-4, and then on voice vote after it was amended in the Senate. Now, rather than following in this bipartisan tradition, and rather than work to ensure that women are further protected from this abuse, this bill does the opposite. It would be the first time that Congress would weaken protections for victims and actually empower abusers to do more harm. That this bill is worse than current law should not be in dispute. The bill is opposed by every leading domestic violence organization, including the National Network to End Domestic Violence that represents over 2,000 domestic violence advocates and service providers across the country. These are not partisan groups. They're the organizations in every state, including in each of your districts, on the front lines against domestic violence. Joining them are the leading faith-based groups, including the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops and the National Association of Evangelicals, which also provide services for battered women and which strongly oppose the rollback for immigrant victims in this bill. We checked with them. They still oppose the rollbacks for battered immigrant women in the bill, even if the Adams Amendment is offered and adopted. Now, it's not every day that the National Organization for Women and the evangelicals agree, but they do in this case, and I think it's one of the reasons why you should look favorably on the amendment that we will offer, which is the exact same amendment bill that was passed by the Senate. Now, in addition to the religious groups and the domestic violence opponents and service providers, law enforcement agencies and officers with years of fighting domestic violence have supported the Senate bill and indicate that the provisions in the House bill will hamper their effort to fight crime. Against all this history, all this opposition, the Judiciary Committee charged ahead with changes on the program based on nothing but unsubstantiated allegations of fraud without any evidence. There are no government reports or credible third-party reports indicating fraud related to VAWA. The committee held no hearings on whether fraud exists in the program. Indeed, there was no hearing on VAWA at all. There was no hearing on the bill or whether the changes proposed would actually eliminate fraud or even increase it. And even though the committee members drafted this bill without input from domestic violence advocates, there was no hearing on how the proposed changes might affect battered women seeking help. There was no process around this bill except for a single markup where the majority justified its rollback of long-standing, bipartisan, and critical protections for domestic violence victims on nothing, absolutely nothing, but a few anecdotes of possible fraud that were raised for the very first time at that markup. Even now, we don't know enough about the anecdotes to look into them, verify them, or refute them. The only anecdote we do know anything about is one story cited by the chairman over and over again at the markup, and if true, this was an individual who was called by the Senate, and there may have been an issue, but it was a single instance in 1998. That is the basis for rolling back these protections. We don't know much about the other anecdotes thrown around at the markup. Some of those peddling these stories have been exposed as having a financial interest in seeking protections for battered immigrant spouses, weakened or repealed. All you have to do is Google the word VAWA these days, and you can quickly figure out who lines up where. Opponents to the rollbacks in H.R. 4970 are domestic violence advocates, battered women's shelters, university scholars, researchers, the Catholic Church, evangelicals, national women's organizations, law enforcement officers who fight domestic violence every day, and the only groups who openly support these provisions are groups like SAVE and A Voice for Men, who align themselves not with battered women, but with the spouses found by the government who have abused them. You should read for yourself the federal jury verdict finding that the treasurer of SAVE and the owner of a mail-order bride company, Natasha Spivak, intentionally refused to tell a pregnant Russian immigrant who was being severely beaten by her U.S. citizen husband about VAWA protections so she could protect her business in its 95% success rate. Or maybe you should read SAVE's website and how it trumpets as a key fact that, quote, female initiation of partner violence is the leading reason for women becoming a victim of subsequent violence. You should read also the statement of A Voice for Men that belittles women, and you'll see that these are advocacy groups you may not wish to be associated with. The manager's amendment doesn't address the gaps in protection and services for victims who are battered or abused. It contains very troubling new language about the ability for Native American women to obtain judicial protection orders. The committee needs to ask itself whether it wants to align itself with the bipartisan Senate where every single woman in the Senate, Republicans and Democrats, voted for a bill, or whether you want to be the outliers on protecting women and others against violence. I would hope that we could work together in a bipartisan way, as the Senate did, reject the bill that came out of the judiciary, and instead adopt, as an amendment in the nature of a substitute, the bill that the Senate reported that is a collaborative, bipartisan bill. It's offered by Mr. Conyers and Ms. Moore and myself, and which we recommend very much to you.
Thank you very
Mr.
much,
Chairman.
Ms. Lofgren. Let me just say to my friend, Ms. Moore, that there's nobody on this panel I'd rather hear from you, but we're tying this exclusively to members of the Judiciary Committee, and there are a number of members who are senior to you who are not on the committee, and so we're going to complete with the Judiciary Committee, and then we're going to go to those members who are not on the Judiciary Committee who want to be heard on this. So, Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll introduce my statement for the record. It's an amendment I'm introducing to eliminate the mandatory minimums in the bill. The mandatory minimums have been studied and been shown to often violate common sense, waste taxpayers' money, and do nothing to reduce crime. In this case, in addition to the normal arguments against mandatory minimums, in this case you have the situation where many abused victims will be less likely to go forward if they know their abuser, who may be a family member, may be subjected to draconian mandatory minimums. For this reason, I would hope you to make the amendment in order. And I'd ask you accepting statement.
Without objection, it'll be included in the record. Ms. Jackson-Lee.
Chairman, you need to get to the next person.
You're on the committee.
No, you're the last person to
I'm the
testify here.
last
Yes.
person? Okay. Let me, my amendment is very simple, and thank you all for your courtesies. Just got off an airplane. Mine is to increase the number of rape kits backlog, increase the percentage of those that are going to be tested. My amendment will reauthorize the Debbie Smith DNA Backlog Grant Program through 2017. The program has been effective in reducing rape kit backlogs, but not effective enough. It would help law enforcement better collect and use evidence in sexual assault cases and help all levels of the criminal justice system work together to ensure that rape kits are tested. In actuality, there is not really an assessment of how many rape kits in various jurisdictions are backlogged. I can cite the City of Houston as having an enormous backlog. There have been widespread reports in the media of backlogs. This is unacceptable. One of the aspects of this amendment is to ensure that we take an account of what the backlog is. Every 2 hours in the United States, it is estimated that 60 individuals will be a victim of a sexual assault. VAWA reauthorization contains many of the provisions that make important changes to the current law. However, it is important that we focus on the amount of these kits that keep women from justice. If you, in fact, allow the number to go from 40 to 70, which is what my amendment will do, 70% investigation to provide an increase in the amount of funding to ensure that 70% of these kits are tested, you will bring an added justice to women. So I would ask that my amendment be made in order. Law enforcement agencies were required to report their rape kit backlogs to the Department of Public Safety by mid-October of last year. This has not happened.
Thank you very much.
So we know that there is a great backlog, and we ask that that we join together in a bipartisan manner and make the amendment in order. I yield back.
Mr. Sessions.
I have no questions. Thank you.
Mr. McGovern.
I don't know the background of anyone else. I know a little bit about Mr. Scott's background. I was listening while the young lady from California was talking, whom I have great respect for. I spent 16 years prosecuting women who perpetrate violence against women. And the bill that she describes I'm unfamiliar with. It's certainly not the bill that we marked up in judiciary.
What?
So
Well, let me just so that you understand that she's not alone in this. I want to ask unanimous consent to submit to the record a list of, right now, of 325 organizations, from the Advocates for Basic Legal Equality to the YWCA USA.
Without objection, the list will be included in the record.
Also like to submit to the record the Statement of Administration Policy.
Without objection, the Statement of Administration Policy will be included in the record as well.
Recommended to vote against the bill. So, I mean, clearly, I mean, I understand you want to defend the product that you have come up with, but there's a feeling that there wasn't bipartisan cooperation. And given that reality, the Senate had a bipartisan bill. This is an important issue. I mean, wouldn't it, at a minimum, be the right thing to do to allow us to bring up the Senate bill on the floor, given the fact that it enjoys such a broad bipartisan support. I mean, you could vote against it. I'm just saying that, rather than a closed rule, I wish everybody shut out and it's your way or no way. I mean, given the concerns on this issue, wouldn't that be the right thing to do?
I assume the gentleman is not including the provision of the Senate bill that is patently unconstitutional because it trumps the Oliphant case, the Supreme Court case. So there are certain parts of the Senate bill that while they may make good politics, no, I would not bring a bill that has a patently unconstitutional provision before the House.
So you here arguing that what this committee should do is to basically report a closed rule and shut everybody out?
I don't think it's...
Given the contentious nature of what we've just heard here?
I'm not on the Rules Committee, but I don't think it would be unprecedented to do that.
No, it is not unprecedented, unfortunately, to give closed rules up here.
Well, I wasn't here for previous administrations. I don't think it was unprecedented then either.
Given the fact that there was the Catholic Conference of Bishops, I mean, this is... This is a little bit...
Is that the same group that says Jesus wouldn't like Paul Ryan's budget? I mean, we can find groups that like and don't like. We can make up groups if we want to. I'm telling you, I did it for 16 years. I did it for 16 years, and I watched a state that led the nation in men killing women make real, significant, substantive improvement because of violence against women grants. So I think this bill would make tremendous progress. So, I mean, can you demagogue issues? Can you come up with a bumper sticker? Yeah, that can be done.
With all due respect, all I'm asking for is, a little democracy here. That's all. And there's some difference of opinions here, and they were shut out in terms of the committee process. And
I respectfully disagree. There were a lot of amendments. We spent a long time in judiciary. Some of them were adopted. I believe a Democrat amendment was adopted. Mr. Scott can correct me if I'm wrong about that, but. Yeah, I mean, we can talk about democracy. That's what we had last November.
I'll just conclude with this. There seems to be a pattern developing in the House of Representatives where every time there is a bipartisan initiative that comes together, and we've seen that with the transportation bill, and now we're seeing it with this bill here, all of a sudden it becomes a political football on the House side. And I think that this issue, if you want to take the politics out of it, you ought to let people have an opportunity to be able to amend it or have alternatives on the floor.
Well, I would agree with you that things become political footballs that should not. And the rhetoric that is used against those who would vote for this bill, I just find to be it's hyperbolic. It's that bumper sticker mentality.
This has never been a political football.
I just listened to an opening statement that made it one, that listed anyone who could support this bill must necessarily not care about violence against women. And I'm here to tell you I spent 16 years proving to the contrary.
Thank you, Joe.
Mr. Bishop. Mr. Hastings.
Okay. Excluded from H.R. 4970.
Would the representative repeat that question for me?
Yeah. Why was the campus save provision excluded from 4970? Yeah.
Would Mr. Hastings allow me to consult with someone so I could get you the proper answer?
Follow me.
Mr. Hastings, I am told that another committee, the Committee on Education and Workforce, has jurisdiction over the Clery Act and that they are in the process of planning a reauthorization to that, and that's the best answer I could give the gentleman from Florida.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Woodall.
Brief question for the gentleman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee. I just wanted to ask her her opinion of the bill and if she thinks that this bill could actually serve to increase violence against women with some of its immigration restrictions and other restrictions.
I absolutely do, and I'm glad the gentleman asked me the question, having served for many years along with Ms. Loughran on the Immigration Subcommittee. We all know that police need to have, there are 2 points that I'd like to make. First of all, police need to have a relationship with the victim where the victim feels confident in those witnesses to be able to tell what happened. Secondarily, in this bill requires the law enforcement to notify the abuser of the immigrant. And once you do that, everyone knows, it's documented well, that if you notify the abuser of the victim, you're certainly diminishing the victim's ability to either stay alive or to stay unabused or to stay unfound, and you certainly are diminishing the victim's ability to participate in the prosecution of this victim. So it really undermines it, and I'm glad you asked the question. I wanted to additionally just put in the record on this rape kit that this amendment takes it from 40% to 70% test, but just to put on the record that untested rape kits are found in places such as police department evidence rooms, crime laboratories, hospitals, clinics, rape crisis centers, therefore making it extremely hard for these victims to find justice. And unless we increase the numbers of those who are tested, unless we find where they are, meaning that we go to those places and test those rape kits, I can assure you, you are diminishing justice, and this bill does not include that, and I'd ask both for the openness of the rules process and the recognition of what this bill does to women.
I thank the gentlelady. I will also be trying to, if the amendment that I offered, which strikes sections 801, 802, 806, and 813, the provisions that would prevent U visas from being convertible into permanent status and further drive abuse in the immigrant population underground, if that's not made in order under the rule, I will propose an amendment and urge my colleagues to support that, to allow for that. And I'd like to go to Ms. Lofgren.
Yeah, Ms. Rose, in addition to the changes in the U visa, which will put individuals at risk, and certainly the law enforcement community has...
And to be clear on that, it means that it almost guarantees deportation after, is it 3 years?
4.
After 4 years. So effectively, these people would be protected for a while under the U visa, but then they would face a certain deportation if they come forward and report abuse.
That's correct. But it would also change provisions in existing law that Republicans crafted that allows women who have been subjected to violence by their spouses to petition for themselves if they can document the abuse. It changes provisions relative to that so that abusers could be notified, and that practically the only increased evidentiary standard in the entire immigration code would be applied to victims of domestic violence, women who came here marrying U.S. citizens thinking they were getting the American dream and getting the American nightmare. I'd like to say that Ted Poe, who is a guy, is a very conservative man, we don't always agree, but I was proud that he voted with Democrats on this amendment, because he knows that this would be a step backwards.
Mr. Chairman,
I'll yield back to the chair if somebody else would like to address it.
Would like to be recognized to respond. Let me just say that all time has expired on the vote downstairs. We have 150 members who have not voted. I think 3/4 of them are sitting in this room right now. But we'll obviously have to reconvene after the last of 3 votes. And so why don't we get Mr. Gowdy's response, see if any other members, we have 2 members left to ask questions, and then we'll go down and vote. We'll excuse this panel, and then we'll proceed with the litany of members who are not on the Judiciary Committee. So, Mr. Gowdy?
Very briefly, to the gentleman from Colorado and the gentlelady from California, I believe the manager amendment does away with the prior notification. So I stand to be corrected, but the concern, Mr. Chairman, about notifying the perpetrator, that is no longer in the manager's amendment.
Thank you very much. Mr. Nugent. Mr. Webster. Thank you all very much for being here. The committee will stand in recess. We'll reconvene and hear from the remaining 8 or 9 witnesses. you okay if we begin this process? The Rules Committee will reconvene. We're awaiting a quorum, but Mr. Hastings has very generously allowed us to proceed. We're going to begin with Mr. Lobiondo and Mr. Visklosky, and then if the other members who are not on the committee will come to the table as well, Mr. Griffith, Ms. Schakowsky, Ms. Biggert, and Ms. Moore, and Mr. Johnson, and Ms. Edwards. So we'll go in that order of testimony, which is based on seniority, and so Mr. Lobiondo will begin with you, and then go to Mr. Visklosky. And without objection, any prepared statement that you have will appear in the record in its entirety, and we welcome your summary. Mr. Lobiondo.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Appreciate it very much. Mr. Visklosky and I are very pleased to be doing this together again this year, as we have for a number of years. We know this is the one program that actually will save the lives of law enforcement officers, and we believe that this is a good vehicle to put it in. I know, Mr. Chairman, that you have had a very long evening, so I will submit my statement.
Without objection, it'll appear in the record. Doesn't look like it was that long anyway. So, Mr. Visklosky.
Mr. Chairman, I have no statement would associate myself with Mr. Lobiondo. The fact is, in 2005, this was added as an amendment to the underlying bill, so it's germane. Since its inception in 1998, over 800,000 tests have been provided, so we would appreciate the committee's consideration.
Thank you very much. Mr. Griffith. Please stay. Well, if members have questions, so please just, you can sit over there right next to Mr. Lobiondo. So just move over a little, Frank, and please.
Mr. Chairman, my amendment's fairly straightforward. It just makes it clear that states that don't have a penalty attached to an assault on a family member can also create a process where those members, those people who have been convicted of that misdemeanor crime can at some point in the future apply to the state and have their rights restored. Currently in the Commonwealth of Virginia, this is the only misdemeanor that takes away any rights. It's only because of federal law. And if you're a felon, you can get your rights back. But if you're a misdemeanor or misdemeanor, you've had a misdemeanor conviction, you cannot get your rights back. This allows the federal law to recognize a process whereby somebody convicted of a misdemeanor sometime in their past who clearly has demonstrated to the Commonwealth that, or to the state, that they have changed their ways, would be allowed to get their rights back.
Thank you very much. Ms. Schakowsky.
I'm just going to be brief because I'm supporting the Conyers-Moore-Lofgren amendment, which is essentially the Senate bill. And just to say that my main reason is that 4970, I think, is a...
I think you need to turn the microphone on there, Ms. Schakowsky. There we
no,
go.
it wasn't on. Sorry.
Thank you.
That it's a step backwards, particularly for battered immigrant women. And I'm going to leave it to Representative Moore to go into detail. But let me just express my disappointment that, we have a bipartisan bill that came out of the Senate. This has always been a bipartisan process, and it seems to me that we ought to be able to include the portion, that we ought to be able to do the Senate bill, and that we not take a step backwards and put battered immigrant women in a more precarious situation than they have been. I'll leave my,
for the record. Without objection, you're prepared to say more in the record. Ms. Biggert?
Mr. Chairman, I've got, let me just say I would, first of all, like to associate myself with the remarks of the gentlelady from California,
Ms.
Lofgren, because I've been here for quite a while, too, and we've always worked to have a bipartisan bill in this, and I'm afraid that somehow we've gotten off track. First, we had our side doing the bill, and then I think Gwen and I really worked together, and then suddenly Gwen was off my bill, and she has her own bill, and so we aren't getting together from either side. So I have an amendment to offer to 4970, and that is, like many, I'm very concerned with the current bill, even with the changes made in the manager's amendment, and that doesn't reflect everything.
Please, all members are given the right to ask you questions. So,
doesn't reflect everything we've learned over the past 5 years in terms of what works for, best for victims or prosecutors. And when I spent time talking to all the advocates in my district, and we went over the Leahy bill title by title by title, and they strongly support the provisions that would clarify equal treatment for LGBT individuals and bolster enforcement on Native American reservations, and I see no reason to exclude those provisions from the House bill. And there's no special class of treatment being considered here. We're simply clarifying the law to reflect what everyone knows about modern society. Anyone can be a victim of domestic violence. It can happen in the same-sex household, a college campus, or a Native American reservation, and our victim service providers on the front lines just want to know that they can help anyone who comes through the door. My amendment would restore the language that has been the subject of extensive collaboration within the anti-violence community for over 2 years. Most of these changes are technical, but they would ensure that no one falls through the cracks. What we're talking about a Native American woman who was caught between tribal and a state law, or a college student who has been a victim of stalking, these are changes that matter. Towards that end, my amendment makes changes in 3 separate areas of the bill. It would modernize the law definitions to reflect the input of victim service providers. It would include specific protections for immigrant victims, and it would clarify that LGBT individuals can be served by VAWA programs in all states. Before I close, I would like to praise Congresswoman Adams for restoring the authority of the Vermont Service Center in her manager's amendment. The specialized expertise that the Service Center's employees offer to victims is critical to their security and safety, and appreciate the changes that recognizes that fact. So, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I don't think we need a perfect bill. We need a bill that can provide a solid foundation on which to begin conference negotiations with the Senate. This amendment would bring us closer to that goal, and I urge my colleagues to support it.
Thank you very much, Ms. Figert. Finally, Ms. Moore.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Chair and members of the Rules Committee. I will not read my brief remarks, but I'll submit them for the record. I do want to associate myself with the comments of Ms. Lofgren. I think she gave an exhaustive discussion of what is lacking in the current bill that's before us, and why we need to take up the Senate substitute, which is similar to the bill that I authored on the House side. This bill, of course, the substitute amendment is a bipartisan bill, and the vote was 68-31 coming out of the Senate, which is, I can't think of anything in recent time that has garnered as much bipartisan support as the Senate substitute. And so I would hope that that would be something that this committee would consider as worthy of taking up here. The only other thing that I would add to what has already been said by so many is I just want to elucidate that the bill before us weakens the provisions, and according to the National Task Force in Sexual and Domestic Violence Against Women, it is extremely dangerous for immigrant women and their families. So not only does it roll back those protections, but it actually puts them in a position where it creates so many obstacles for them that it puts them in imminent danger. Also, we are literally creating a sanctuary, I think, for men who commit crimes on tribal lands. 72% overall of the populations of tribal areas are non-native people. And so when you consider the sexual assault and abuse and battering that occurs on those lands, and that half of them are not prosecuted because they're often miles and miles away from any local county seat, we are really creating an environment and a cauldron, I think, that invites that kind of abuse. So I would hope that this committee would remember that this has always been a bipartisan initiative, And it will continue to be. It'll be an unbroken chain of bipartisan cooperation if, in fact, this committee adopts the substitute and not take up the initiative that has 325 groups opposed to it. And as Ms. Lofgren said, those groups range from evangelicals, Catholic priests, to the National Organization of Women, and everyone in between. And so thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all of you for your very thoughtful testimony. Obviously, what we're going to do here will be a first step in a process which is proceeding, and your input has been very helpful. Ms. Fox.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have no questions.
Mr. McGovern.
I think, again, given the way this is all played out, I mean, if ever there was a call for an open rule, it's probably on this. And I would, and by an open rule, Mr. Griffith, I would even, that would mean you'd be able to offer your amendment, which I find, to be honest with you, troubling, that on a bill that kind of takes away rights of victims, that I look at yours as a way to expand rights for people who are abusers. But nonetheless, I mean, I think we ought to have a debate on the floor on this stuff. And again, the fact that in the Senate there was such unbelievable bipartisanship, and the fact that we have had this unprecedented bipartisanship on this issue in the past, even when Republicans were in charge, to be here today and to have this turn into such a political mess is really unfortunate. So I hope that that everybody gets on with their amendments.
Thank you. Mr. Woodall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just had one question for Ms. Biggert. When Mr. Gowdy was here earlier, they were talking about safe campuses, and he said this is not within our jurisdiction. It's going to be over in the Ed and Labor Committee. I know you're a leader on the Ed and Labor Committee. Thinking about your amendment, are your concerns something that you can address when Ed and Labor marks up, or are these primarily judicial?
The one concern is about the colleges and the reporting. That would be, if that goes to the jurisdiction of the Education Committee, that would be a concern to make sure that the reporting is included.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Hastings, questions? Mr. Nugent, Mr. Scott, Mr. Webster. Thank you very much to all of you for being here. Thanks for coming back after the vote. And that will conclude the hearing for consideration of 4970. And so we'll be in receipt of a motion. You can just give it to the clerk right there. Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. You bet. Thanks, Gwen. Nice to see you. Chair will be in receipt of a motion from the gentlewoman from Grandfather Community.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee grant H.R. 4970, the Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act of 2012, a closed rule.
Can we close the door? And we're trying to proceed with our markup here. If we could have our friends carry their conversations out to the hall. Gentlewoman from Grandfather Community.
The rule provides 1 hour debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on the Judiciary. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that the amendment in the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on the Judiciary, now printed in the bill, as modified by the amendment printed in the Rules Committee report, shall be considered as adopted. The bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. The rule provides one motion to recommit with or without instructions. The rule also provides for consideration of H.R. 4310, the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2013. The rule provides 1 hour general debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Armed Services. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. Lastly, the rule provides that after general debate, the Committee of the Whole shall rise without motion and that no further consideration of the bill shall occur except pursuant to a subsequent order of the House.
You've heard the motion of the gentlewoman. Let me just explain the rule. First, we are going to allow for general debate on the defense authorization bill, as we discussed, and then tomorrow when we convene, we will consider the 240 amendments that have been submitted to the Rules Committee for the defense authorization bill, and of course, we're going to proceed with the Violence Against Women Act. I think that we all can agree that, based on the testimony that we've had this evening. This is simply a first step. I'm supportive of this because I want to move the process forward. I think a number of the provisions in the Senate bill are very worthy of consideration. What I'd like to do is see us get to conference and address those measures, those items of concern through that forum. I also want to say that the Adams amendment, the manager's amendment, is one that is, in fact, moving in the direction of the Senate bill. And I know that many have believed that it doesn't go far enough, but it does move in that direction, and so I think that this is an important step. And so I really see this as our effort to move the ball down the field. I agree with the statements that have been made about the necessity for this to be a bipartisan measure, as was pointed out this past in the Senate by a 68-31 vote. And I think that proceeding as we are right now will at least allow us to move in that direction. Are there any amendments? Mr. McGovern.
Mr. Chairman, first let me say I'm glad that the chairman said he wants the process to move forward, and I'm just trying to figure out when, in moving the process forward, it was not having amendments on the floor and debate on the floor, a part of moving the process forward.
The gentleman yield. I will tell you that obviously there will be a debate on the floor. We'll have an hour of debate on the rule, and then we'll proceed with consideration of this measure. And the idea is, since the Senate by a 68-31 vote passed this measure, and it should be a very bipartisan effort in the House as well, if we can pass this measure, we can get it to conference, and then obviously those issues, and I personally hope that we'll be able to move closer to the Senate position on this, ensuring that we address a number of the concerns that were out there. I thank my friend for yielding.
And I appreciate the chairman's comments, but this is a different bill. I mean, this is, and what you heard here over and over by members of not only our side, but even Ms. Biggert talked about the unfortunate fact that this was not a bipartisan endeavor. That we want an opportunity to vote on what we think is the right way to proceed. And if you want to vote against it, you're more than welcome to vote against it. But the idea of not giving us the opportunity to allow for this substitute to come forward, I think is pretty outrageous. So let me begin by saying that I have an amendment to the rule. I move that the committee grant H.R. 4970 an open rule so that all members have the opportunity to offer amendments to the bill on the floor. And Mr. Chairman, this bill, which calls itself a VAWA, or a VAWA reauthorization bill, is nothing of the sort. It actually rolls back protection for women, weakening current law. And that happened because Republicans shut the minority out and wrote this bill behind closed doors. VAWA reauthorization has always been bipartisan. We've heard that over and over and over again tonight. And I find it very sad that the Republicans have broken that tradition. This bill should get an open rule, plain and simple. This committee can open the door to a bipartisan process for this bill, so I'm asking my Republican colleagues to vote yes on my motion.
Vote occurs on the McGovern amendment. Those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. No.
I ask for a roll call vote.
Clerk, call the roll.
Mr. Sessions. Ms. Fox. No. Ms. Fox, no. Mr. Bishop. No. Mr. Bishop, no. Mr. Woodall. No. Mr. Woodall, no. Mr. Nugent. No. Mr. Nugent, no. Mr. Scott. No. Mr. Scott, no. Mr. Webster. No. Mr. Webster, no. Ms. Slaughter. Mr. McGovern.
Aye.
Mr. McGovern, aye. Mr. Hastings. Aye. Mr. Hastings, aye. Mr. Polis. Mr. Chairman.
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Mr. Clerk, the total.
2 yeas, 7 nays.
And the amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments?
Yes.
Mr. McGovern.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to the rule. I move the committee make an order and give the necessary waivers for the amendment by Mr. Conyers and Ms. Moore, amendment number 6. This amendment is the real VAWA reauthorization. It's the bipartisan bill that passed the Senate on a vote of 68-31. And unlike the Republican bill, it doesn't roll back protection for battered women.
For the motion, gentlemen, the vote occurs on the McGovern amendment. Those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. Pay the chair the no.
As for roll call.
Clerk, call the roll.
Mr. Sessions. Ms. Fox. No. Ms. Fox, no. Mr. Bishop. No. Mr. Bishop, no. Mr. Woodall. No. Mr. Woodall, no. Mr. Nugent. No. Mr. Nugent, no. Mr. Scott. No. Mr. Scott, no. Mr. Webster. No. Mr. Webster, no. Ms. Slaughter. Mr. McGovern.
Aye.
Mr. McGovern, aye. Mr. Hastings. Aye. Mr. Hastings, aye. Mr. Polis. Mr. Chairman.
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Total.
2 yeas, 7 nays.
The amendment's not agreed to. Are there further amendments? Mr. Hastings?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I have a question, and that's we've been informed by the Budget Committee that the Republican manager's amendment violates the cut-go rule. Do you still plan to self-execute the amendment, even though it violates
I
Cutco?
wasn't aware of that. I'm sorry, we're not aware of that on our side here.
Well,
We're planning to make an order, but I mean, are we?
the manager's amendment, my understanding is,
For the minority, I guess, not the majority, as we've done this.
well, the manager's amendment would generate direct spending for programs such as Medicaid, SNAP, Social Security, by providing a path to legal permanent resident status for a certain group of U visa holders. And because of the plan to deem the amendment's passage without a separate vote, it seems that you don't have to technically waive Cutco, but you are, in some respects, waiving Cutco. But in any event, Mr. Chairman,
So I guess we won't be waiving Cutco then.
well,
I mean, if you
you're
want,
violating Cutco, or maybe not.
that's your
waiving.
interpretation, I guess.
Well, matches yours. But anyway, I would ask unanimous consent to insert in the record the statement of Congresswoman Laura Richardson of
Without
California.
objection, Ms. Richardson's statement will be included.
And I would like to lift from that statement, which also is supported by my colleague from Florida, Ms. Brown, but I'd like to lift from the first full paragraph of the second page of her remarks in the middle. It said, "This is obviously a sad attempt to flip the script and say that Democrats did not support the Violence Against Women Act reauthorization, when the real reason is because Republicans have stripped the bill of vital protections. This has provided immigrant victims, tribal women, and the LGBT community for the past 18 years. I think it's a very sad commentary, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment to the rule. I move the committee make an order and give the necessary waivers for the amendment offered by Mr. Scott of Virginia, number 5, which would take out the mandatory minimums from this bill. Mr. Scott gave an elucidation of mandatory minimums. We've seen the perniciousness of it in our society, and unrelated to this bill, we have one of the most glaring examples of how mandatory minimums can be abused. And there's a lady in Florida that was in a dispute with her husband. She shot in the air in the garage, and she's faced with a minimum mandatory of 20 years. I commented to someone, if she had just shot him and he hadn't died, it might very well have just been aggravated battery and might have been 10 years. If she had shot him in the foot, it might just have been an assault. We can't do these kind of things to our society, and we can't build enough jails to handle all of these issues. I hope we can support and give Mr. Scott the necessary waivers to introduce this measure.
Vote occurs on the Hastings Amendment. Those in favor will say aye. Those
Aye.
opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The noes.
I ask for a
Mr. Clerk, call the
recorded
roll.
vote.
Mr. Sessions. Ms. Fox. No. Ms. Fox, no. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop, no. Mr. Woodall. No. Mr. Woodall, no. Mr. Nugent. No. Mr. Nugent, no. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott, no. Mr. Webster. Mr. Webster, no. Ms. Slaughter. Mr. McGovern.
Aye.
Mr. McGovern, aye. Mr. Hastings.
Yes.
Mr. Hastings, aye. Mr. Polis. Mr. Chairman.
No.
Chairman, no.
Clerk, total.
2 yeas, 7 nays.
And the amendments not agreed. There are further amendments? If not, as we proceed to vote, let me just say that, again, my support of this measure is based on the fact that we are going to be able to resolve many of the very important questions that have been raised in a conference with the Senate, and I hope very much that we'll be able to move forward so we can get there. The vote occurs on the motion of the woman from the community.
Mr. Chairman, could I ask a question?
Webster.
I should have asked it earlier, but it just dawned on me. Is the Senate bill and the House bill identical in dollar amounts?
I'm not sure about that. I'm not in a position. They are, apparently, I've been told by staff. So I hope very much that we'll be able to bring about a resolution on. The vote occurs on the motion of the gentleman from Grandfather Community. Those in favor will say aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
The ayes have it. The ayes have it.
I ask for a roll call, Mr.
Clerk, call the roll.
Mr. Sessions. Ms. Fox. Aye. Ms. Fox, aye. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. Woodall. Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Nugent. Mr. Nugent, aye. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott, aye. Mr. Webster. Mr. Webster, aye. Ms. Slaughter. Mr. McGovern.
No.
Mr. McGovern, no. Mr. Hastings. No. Mr. Hastings, no. Mr. Polis. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, aye.
Total?
7 yeas, 2 nays.
And the motion is agreed to, and Ms. Fox will be managing for the majority.
Mr. Polis.
And Mr. Polis for the minority. And tomorrow, we are scheduled to meet at 2:30 to begin the process of the 240 amendments that have been submitted to us for consideration of the DOD authorization bill. So without objection, the committee stands adjourned.